Hi, today we've got a new soldering station to take a look at. This time it's the Quick TS1200A. This is a 120 watt soldering station, adjustable temperature, and it uses the integrated cartridges, so the heater, temperature sensor all built in to a cartridge type system that then you just plug into the handpiece. Here it is on the Vanguard website, selling for about $220 US. So that's about half the price of something like a Pace ADS 200. Potentially has similar characteristics given that it uses the heater in cartridge type technology, so it'd be interesting to see how this one behaves. They've made a few claims here, so they reckon it will heat up within 8 seconds, so we can test that with a bit of solder. It's fixed voltage on this one, so unlike the Metcal stations, for example, that have a universal input, this one does appear to have a solid transformer in it and no adjustable voltage option. So if you want to buy it for 120 volt territories, you have to buy a specific 120 volt version. It's quite heavy, 2.5 kilos, and then it comes with a handpiece and with a iron stand with a sponge and the brass ball in it. So let's take a closer look at the unit itself. Starting off with the handpiece, as you can see, it's entirely made from plastic. It's a one-piece design, although it does have a rubberized area up here, but this isn't removable or replaceable, so I think when this wears out you do have to replace the handpiece in its entirety, but certainly it doesn't feel like a quality piece of kit. It does feel, you know, very cheap. It has a heat resistant cable exactly 1 meter in length and a DIN style connector that plugs into the soldering station with these locking tabs, and that does click in quite nicely. Now, it did come with one soldering cartridge. It's a very fine tip, 45-degree angled tip here, and considering that this station is capable of 120 watts output, you would think they'd try and deliver something with it that can dump a bit more heat into your circuit board, because these 45-degree tips only sort of have limited usefulness anyway. It seems quite an odd choice to include. So I did order some additional cartridges. You can see I've got a few here, including my 5mm one, so that we can do a fair comparison. Oddly, you can see they've got these quite bulbous areas here on these two cartridges, but on the one that you'd expect to be the highest power, that doesn't exist. And it also looks quite a bit different. So you can see it's got gold connectors at the bottom here. These ones don't have that same colouring. Also, the bottom two have a code, so this is the 1.2D, this is the B type, and then this one has nothing whatsoever printed on it, but they are all genuine Quick cartridges, and looking at images on the internet, they do all have this design for this particular 5mm tip, so I'm not sure why this one doesn't share the same design as the others. And then in terms of cost, I ordered the tips from tme.eu, and they're coming in at £20 each, including VAT, so they're also not cheap, so you would really hope the performance is there, because this is about the same price as a standard JBC T245 cartridge. So you know, there's no discounts here for having a cheaper Chinese station. These ones do cost as much as some of the professional stations. Onto the iron stand, and this is entirely made from metal. It does feel quite heavyweight. It has rubber feet on it, and it doesn't really want to slide away on the bench. It comes with a brass pad for cleaning the tip, as well as a sponge, which you can put in there to clean the tip as well. As far as I know, I can't find any reference to any kind of automatic setback feature or anything like that, so I don't think this has any magnets in it or anything like that to detect when the iron is in the stand. It also has 4 slots for your soldering cartridges, and then it has this intriguing kind of thumb wheel, and it looks like it should allow you to separate this section of the stand. It all looks like it should come away, but I can't for the life of me move it away from the rest of the unit. But also, I would have expected that to probably sit so that when you're using this to clean your tip, you'd be able to get all the little bits of solder out, but it doesn't seem to even be anywhere near that. It seems to just be for this section here, so I don't fully understand what that's all about. And there's no reference to this in the user manual. It's certainly not anything to do with the ESD. It does come with an ESD lead in here, but nothing with a attachment that would allow you to connect it to the stand, so I don't really understand what that's for. Now, when you put it on the bench, it does sit there quite nicely, and it does accept the soldering iron from quite a wide angle. it's certainly not uncomfortable to try and get it into there, and it bottoms out quite nicely in there without wobbling around too much, so that does seem to work quite nicely. If you want to change the tip while it's hot, it does come with one of these pads to allow you to pull the tip out from the soldering iron. It's about half the thickness of the one that you get with the Metcal type stations, but it'll probably do the job. So the idea is you just grab it like this, put it into there, and then insert the new soldering tip. Now I don't know if you can do this with the hot swap type capability or whether you have to cycle the power on the unit to do that, so we'll take a look at that shortly. Onto the control unit, and it does actually look quite smart. I do like the design of this one. We've got an LCD at the front here, along with some capacitive touch buttons to change the settings. So I do hope that these are responsive. There's nothing worse than capacitive touch buttons that don't work very well, and when you're trying to press it, it takes a moment to register. So hopefully those are responsive. We've got the connector off to the handpiece, and then the unit itself is entirely made from plastic. But like I said, I do think it's quite a smart design, certainly not the worst that I've ever seen. If we look at the bottom here, it's quite obvious that there's an iron core transformer bolted in, and you can just about see the laminations through the vent holes here. It does look like this one was made in December 2020, and then we've got the QR code that proves that this is an official quick soldering station. On the back, we've got the AC connection, so on an IEC connector, which is my preferred connector for these types of stations. The quick hot air station that I've got more recently had a fixed cable, and I do find that quite annoying, because when you're feeding the cables down the back of your desk, you then have to account for the size of the AC connector, and obviously our British plugs are quite chunky, so an IEC connector is much more preferred for me. We've got a proper power switch as well when we want to turn it off. Possibly could have been handy to have that at the front. Depending on your desk setup, you might not want to reach around the back to try and switch it on and off. And it does look like this unit possibly is available in some different flavours, because this one looks like it has space for a fan, and this is actually a heatsink bolted on the back here, but there's obviously no fan fitted here. Something was here in another model but isn't here, and then we've got the ground 4mm banana jack, which allows you to connect to the ESD lead that comes with it. So that's about all there is. Did notice that there's no CE marking on this particular device. It seems to be hit and miss with Quick as to whether it's CE marked or not. There are some CE marked hot air stations and soldering stations, but then some of them aren't, and it looks like this one isn't. I was about to have a moan that the screws are hidden under adhesive feet, but these are actually press fit into here, which is much more preferred. There's nothing worse than having to open up a device and then possibly find different feet because the adhesive has all come off, but this doesn't seem to be too bad. Now, in terms of the build quality inside, you tend to know what to expect when you're spending money on a JBC or a Metcal type station, but I'm really intrigued to know what they've got inside here, because it can be anything on the spectrum from absolute junk inside to some really quite fine electronics. So place your bets now. Are we going to have quality or junk inside? Well, it's not looking too bad. That's a really nice transformer, actually, very nicely mounted in there. Fairly decent cable management, and a fairly decent looking PCB, pretty similar to what we've seen on other Quick stations. So let's take it apart a little bit further. What I do notice is there is nothing at the back here that appears to warrant that heat sinking, so that is obviously for some other device. There's literally nothing at the back there other than the connections to the AC input. I was just about to say how nice the design was from an assembly point of view, because it's got these nice connectors that allow us to unplug the front from the rest of the unit, and then they've soldered in two of the leads, which is hugely frustrating. It means that we can't just gracefully disconnect the front from the back. Now we've either got to desolder these earth wires. Admittedly, they are earth cables with a fast-on type connector onto the IEC connector at the back, so we can pull that one off, but we have to cut the cable tie. But the lead that goes onto the 4mm banana jack is actually Loctited on, so yeah, we're not going to be able to break that quite as easily, and I probably don't really want to. I want to keep that intact. So a little bit of a negative point there, but the design is quite interesting. I wasn't expecting to see a completely separate transformer for the control electronics. So we've obviously got our large transformer at the back for our heating element, so This is our 24 or 48 volt AC transformer for the actual soldering iron, but they fitted a small PCB mount transformer, just a little 0.5 VA jobby on the PCB itself, to locally supply power for the electronics on the control board, which is you know, quite a sensible design decision in that they don't have to worry about a specialist transformer here, but it does mean that they've introduced mains onto this front panel PCB, and then potentially there are some creepage and clearance distance issues, although actually already I can see that they've got some slots in here across where it needs to be, so possibly not a bad design at all. And from what I can see, it looks like the AC comes in to this front panel power board, obviously powers this transformer permanently because we need power all the time for the touch button at the front for power, but then there's actually a relay here that appears to connect to the other set of terminals, so that physically turns on the much larger transformer only when we want to actually use it, so it's got like a low power standby state. On the PCB itself, there's nothing too surprising. We've got the STM32 driving the entire design. These seem to be pretty common on these quick stations, and they're quite low cost and fairly powerful processors with lots of peripherals. We've got a bit of memory above it. We've got some electronics to drive the piezo sounder here, and then we've got a triac to actually drive the heating element, and there's some associated electronics with driving that. There appears to be an unpopulated port here, which looks to be for some other kind of display or touch inputs. And then we've got just the standard stuff that you'd normally expect inside one of these soldering stations. So a couple of op amps here. This is a quad op amp, and there's another one just here as well. So this one does have a temperature sensor in the tip, so there'll be one reading the resistance of that and then converting it into a voltage that's proportional to temperature. We've also got some current sensing going in, so one of those, you can see a couple of very thin tracers there around there that seem to be going into this quad op amp here, so it would be measuring effectively power into the heating element, so combined with the voltage and the current through here they can work out how much power is being delivered. And then not a lot else. It does look like we've got something that doesn't look so good just here. This looks to be our bridge rectifier, but that looks for all the world like it has actually blown up or been damaged. Right, after having a look under the microscope and giving it a bit of a clean up, it looks to be something like flux residue where they've soldered these two pins, whatever that is, and some of the heat and the flux ended up on this bridge rectifier, but nothing quite as sinister as it originally looked. So after having a deeper look, it looks like these two pins and then these two, which are the ones that had all the flux residue, you can see a little bit around here as well, are the pins for the LCD backlight on the front panel. So they did have to solder that in afterwards because it appears that the LCD is sort of bonded to the front of the unit. So overall the design doesn't seem too bad. It's pretty much on a par with all of the other quick stations in terms of the PCB layout and everything. I'm sure we could do a better layout if we did it ourselves, but there's nothing out here that stands out to be too crazy. And also, I think you'd be able to stand a good chance of repairing this if something did go wrong. Everything is quite easily identifiable as to what it connects to. All of the part numbers are still on all of the ICs, and you know, with a vague understanding of what's going on inside these stations, you'd be able to work out what to look at if you were having a problem with it. So I think this is fairly respectable for the price point. Right, so we've got the iron connected up, so let's try and power this device on. And that's a very nice clear display actually, really crisp. It seems to have heated up already actually, that was pretty quick to get to 260 degrees. There is a bit of smoke coming off the tip, so we obviously got there that quickly. So from what I can see, we've got 3 set points. And so these first 2, according to the instruction manual, are just standard set points. So for example, if we wanted to change this set point 1, we hold down 1, and then we can set what we actually want that to be. So if we wanted to change that to 330, we can click Store, and then you can see that has been updated. So now we can go to there and it will set our tip temperature to 330 degrees. Now button 3 is a little bit different. If we hold it down, you can see it's got a time, temperature 1 and temperature 2, and in the instruction manual it says this is the sectional welding. I guess it's multiple temperature soldering. I've never had to use this specifically, but basically it sits at 260 degrees C in this instance, and then once you hold the handpiece it will count for 10 seconds and then it will increase to 380, and that appears to be for some dual temperature soldering. I've never come across an instance where you need to do this, but then after you let go of the handle it then drops back down to 260 degrees. But as I said, I don't know what that's for. I've never had to do any soldering that needed that kind of control. Now, other than the presets, you can of course just hold the up and down buttons, and it allows fairly quick change of the temperature. Obviously, my usual criticism, we do not need 1 degree accuracy on setting the temperature. This should really be 5 degree steps or something like that, rather than 1 degree step. It's just unnecessary resolution there. Then we've got a little symbol here which says whether we're approximately at the correct temperature. If we're way below on the tip than where we want the setting, then you can see we've got the arrows pointing up, and when the heater is on you can see that little sun occasionally turns red. Then if we drop back down to 260 you can see the arrows saying that it's trying to drop the temperature. So that's the general user interface. Now the menu is hidden behind button 2 and 3, so you hold down 2 and 3, which I have to say isn't particularly intuitive. And then we've got an ESD test function. The instruction book doesn't really say what that means, but apparently you need to make sure that you have that 4mm banana jack connected into the back of the unit, but that's all that it says, so I don't know what it does in terms of a test. Then underneath we've got the unit, so degrees C or degrees Fahrenheit. We've got the amount of time before it goes into sleep mode, so 10 minutes there before it turns off the heating element. And then we've got the amount of time before the whole system goes into shutdown. Because we've got this soft power on-off button on the front, it can actually completely turn off the main power transformer and all of that electronics. Then we've got a couple of alarms here. I'm not really sure again how useful these are, but basically if the temperature is more than 20 degrees above what our set point is, it will just beep at us until it drops down to that temperature. Similarly, if it's below what we want it to be by, again, 20 degrees C, it beeps at us to let us know that the temperature isn't correct. Then finally we've got whether we want the button tones on and off, the password, which is basically English or Chinese, the language is English or Chinese, password if we want to lock all of the settings so that you can't change anything on here. So that's about it for the functionality, but I do have to say that the display is really nice and crisp and clear, so it looks very modern and very clean. Next up we have the claim that it's ready to heat up within 8 seconds, so let's try that. We'll turn on the power and start the timer. And it did seem to melt the solder at about the 9-second point. I probably started the timer sooner than when it started to heat up the cartridge, but certainly that is fairly a respectable time to be able to begin soldering after turning on your soldering station. Now obviously you've previously seen me mention about the distance between where you hold the soldering iron and the tip where you're actually trying to do the soldering. It's a little bit extended in this case. It's certainly not the worst that I've ever used, but it is that little bit elongated compared to what I would prefer. So we'll just start off with a little bit of general purpose soldering. So we've just got a D2 package here, sorry, a D-pack package. And we'll put the part on here. A little bit slow there to heat up the pad. Let's try again. Yeah, so at 330, it's not quite high enough to be able to melt the solder nicely. So I'll just try taking that up to 345 instead. You can see it took quite a long time there for it to melt that solder. Let's try again. That appears to be a little bit better, and then we'll do the heatsink pad. So not perfect onto there without any flux. Let's try another one of these. So I've just turned the temperature up now to 355, which is higher than I would normally try and solder with. That certainly flowed better that time onto the pad. I wonder if the calibration's out slightly. So with it set to 355, that seems to be a lot more respectable in terms of the soldering performance. We'll try just soldering a few through-hole parts here. This isn't very demanding at all, so I wouldn't expect any trouble with these connections here. Yeah, and that all works very nicely, so no problem with just general purpose soldering onto a standard PCB. So we'll repeat the 2p coin test. Basically I've got 100mm of solder and we'll try and feed this in as fast as possible before it starts causing resistance against the solder wire. So the feed-in rate is basically controlled by the flow of solder into the joint, and then we'll allow it to dwell for a short period of time. So I think what we can see there is the thermal performance into a high thermal demand application is part way between the KSGER T12 station and the JBC in the Metcal station. So the solder spread more than the KSGER, but not quite as much as the JBC. And in a way that suggests that its price point matches its performance, but given that this is rated at 120 watts, you would expect it to be able to meet the performance of the JBC and the Metcal stations, which suggests to me the limitation is in this cartridge design. So for some reason it's not able to get the full 120 watts into the cartridge and into the tip. And that brings me on to the other negative point about this system. The selection of solder tips is pretty limited. This is the entirety. I tend to use a 0.8mm chisel tip for general purpose soldering. I find that seems to work for most things, and then if you need to solder something bigger you can drop onto one of the larger sizes. But the smallest chisel they had is 1.2mm without going to a conical tip, and as you know, conical tips don't always work very well for a lot of people. They do have this super fine pointy one which is useless basically because you can never get the heat into the tip on these soldering iron cartridges. Similarly, these knife shaped ones are not that useful either, and I think if you've got a very limited selection of cartridges you should make sure the tips are the most useful and most relevant ones, and for me these definitely aren't. Maybe for you they would be, but the limitation here is that there's not many to choose from compared to with the JBC and the Metcal stations. Obviously there's absolutely a huge amount of tips available, and I think for the T12 station there's also a huge amount available from Heiko and also the Chinese knockoffs for those. The other point is the lack of automatic setback. So this has gone into sleep mode from not being moved. I changed the timer to 1 minute to test it, and when you do lift it up it immediately goes back into active mode. I've only set the temperature to 200 at the moment, but you really want that ability to reduce the temperature the moment that you put it in the stand, because the whole time that it's sitting there at normal soldering temperature you're decreasing the life of the tip. It's oxidizing, And given that these are relatively expensive cartridges, you want them to last as long as possible. So the fact that it doesn't have the automatic setback feature built in is a bit of a negative point. And they do go to an extent to show you that it's super fast heat up and all this kind of stuff. But if it's that quick, really it should be able to be warm by the time you bring it out of the cradle and are ready to solder. So really this should go to sleep as soon as it stops detecting any movement, or if it had a reed switch and a magnet in here, that should be enough, but they don't do that. And the minimum time that you can set is 1 minute, which is what I've got it set to at the moment, so it goes to sleep in a moment, but I feel like they could do better with that. Other than those points, I do think it's quite a nice station. It's very nicely designed, and I think it's also a much safer design than some of the AC-powered T12 stations that we're seeing from China. I do have some worries about the power supply module that they put into those units, which is why I quite like the mini KSGER unit that I've got, where you can use a completely separate 24-volt power pack, which means that you can use something known, safe and reliable from a UK supplier, for example. This one, I would have absolutely no problem using it. I think the transformers in there are going to give us all the safety that we need, but I don't quite get who the target customer is. If it's for professional use, where you would expect a lot more tip selection, and it's priced at a point where it's probably a little bit expensive for hobbyists, in which case they would be better off with the T12 type station. And the other thing is, at its price point, I would have liked to have seen a higher quality handle, although once it's got the cartridge in, it is fairly well balanced and does feel quite comfortable to use. It just doesn't ooze the same quality as some of the more expensive stations. So a bit of a mixed review there, and I think what I'd probably lean to is suggesting, well, first of all, if you're a professional user, this just isn't the station for you. You would definitely get a JBC or a Pace or a Ursa or a Metcal station. As a hobbyist, I think you would be better off trying to save a bit more money and get something like the Pace ADS 200. I think you'll get much more satisfaction from using that than this unit that does still feel on the cheap end. I will put a link to this unit in the description down below. It links to Banggood. If you manage to get a discount code, which they often have, then that's where this could start becoming viable. But for me, it just misses the mark slightly, and I can't really recommend it. But anyway, I hope you found the video useful. Big thank you to JLC PCB, who are my video sponsor. If you've got any thoughts or comments, leave them in the comments section down below. And until next time, thanks for watching.